And that is how you make a beginner-friendly granny square sweater that's super duper cute. Hi, I'm Rebecca. Today we are going to be going through a beginner-friendly crochet sweater pattern, and at the end, for fun, I'm even going to show you how to make it with sleeves. This video is going to be everything you need and nothing that you don't, whether you're a beginner or you are more experienced and interested in some of the more complicated seaming techniques that we're using. How we're going to accomplish this is each part of the video is actually sectioned out based on topic, and I'm going to both share on the screen when it's a new section and link below so that you can go ahead and save this video, and based on where you are at in your sweater journey, you can keep coming back and only take a look at the sections that you're interested in. We're going to start with what's a little bit different about this pattern and why you might want to make it. Then we're going to jump into materials, hooks, yarn, that type of thing. Then we're going to go into how to make a granny square, which is going to include some links and options depending on your expertise and your preference. Then we're going to do a little section on how to pick colors, since a lot of what makes this sweater really fun is the use and kind of playing around with different color schemes and patterns within the sweaters. 2 different stitch techniques, one being borders and your options for that, followed by how to actually construct the pattern and join everything together so that you end up with a beautiful sweater. Lastly, we are going to talk about how to add sleeves, since the design of this was originally so that I could put a sleeve on it, and as you can see, I have successfully done so in the second pattern next to me, so we will cover that as well. If you're somebody who is an absolute expert and you just want to jump straight into seaming, I'm going to tell you ahead of time right now that you are going to need a total of 17 granny squares. So go ahead, make those granny squares, and I'll meet you back. If you are an absolute beginner, I recommend taking this video section by section. First, I learned how to make the granny squares. Then when I was ready to start making them into something, I learned how to do a border. Then I learned how to do the stitch to seam them together. And then I played around and figured out how to come up with a sweater. So again, if you are brand new, just go section by section, get to where you need to get to, and come back when you're ready for the next step. I promise this is absolutely doable for absolute beginners, because that's what I was when I was approaching this. So first things first, are you excited? I am too. Go ahead and hit that save button so that you have this to use later and start wherever you need, because again, you will have all of the cues right below for all those different sections, so you can just rewatch the pieces that you need at whatever pace you need. If you're used to making sweaters, you'll be really familiar with the fact that pretty much everything is a rectangle. I personally come from more of a dressmaking background, so the way I approached this was actually in the shape of more of an actual garment pattern, and I really wanted this to have more of a dolman sleeve feel, which is basically this drop shoulder, and I'll include some diagrams here, which adds a little bit more roundness, adds a little bit more shape, and to me feels a little bit more relaxed and interesting. So how we do this means that we basically have to take things that start out as squares, which our granny squares are, and then join them together in a way that makes some curves. So that's what we're going to cover in the pattern and seaming portion of this. There's absolutely some flexibility when it comes to what materials you're going to use for this, but I'm going to tell you exactly what I used and then talk about where there's some room to adjust as you would like. So this was made primarily with a size 10mm hook. So that would be this one here. And the primary yarn that I used was this Perle. It is a virgin wool by Lana Grossa. The needle recommendation size on this is a 910, so it is a good fit for this hook size, and what it achieves is this very chunky looking pattern. You will also need a size 7 hook to do some of the stitching inside. That'll make things a little bit tighter. Could you use a smaller hook on this? You absolutely could. I'm going to show you. So this is the same yarn on, I believe, a size 6.5. And as you can see, it does end up a little bit smaller, but this is also one more round around to make it a little bit bigger. So if you did want something a little bit tighter, you could use a smaller hook. So the hook size is actually more important than having an exact yarn size, because a lot of times granny squares are meant to be kind of yarn busters, right? So you can get something that's your super chunky like this, that's some of the largest yarn you can get, Or say you had something lying around like this Super Bingo, which is a merino with a size 6-7 European hook size, that works as well. Because let me show you, within this, we have, this is an even chunkier yarn right here, this rainbow guy. This pink is the Super Bingo, but see, as you can see, it creates the same size. I also have a Puno somewhere. Oh, this is an extra chunky one. And then this is a Puno here. So this is more of kind of that chain. But as you can see, the yarn size doesn't matter quite as much as your hook size. These are going to be linked below if you have any questions about the specifics that I'm talking about. So next section, how to do a granny square. The concept of a granny square is pretty much the same pattern that's happening in a square, so generally in 4 areas around, in kind of concentric, I'd say, squares, going outward. So it's the same pattern repeated over and over, depending on what your particular granny square pattern is. There are so many different techniques for making granny squares, patterns for making granny squares. This is from a book that I love, that I would highly recommend, that you will be able to crochet by the end of this book. I will link it below because it's a great reference. So I used a European single crochet on my particular granny squares. So a single crochet here. This pattern can be made pretty much by any granny square. They're going to be about the same size depending on how many rounds that you do. And this one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rounds for each of the granny squares. When you're trying to decide what granny square to do, if you have one that you've been practicing or that you want to practice, that's great. I'll link some videos down below. For this particular one, somehow I ended up doing a single crochet in a very traditional granny square pattern. And then one other kind of strange thing that I did is, when you are going between these outer sections, you usually do a chain of 2, and I actually only did a chain of 1, and let me show you what that does. Have the single crochet here in all of these rings, and when you finish, if you only do 1 chain between each of these sections, you end up with something that isn't quite a perfect square. It's a little bit tighter through here, because to make it a perfectly balanced square, you really should be doing a chain of 2 between. But one thing that I really like about that, and why it was intentional on my side of things, is that when you go and do the border, you're going to do the standard number of border stitches, which actually starts to square it out quite a bit. And just by having that single chain between each of your batches of 3, you actually make the entire weave slightly smaller. Or when you end up putting this all together and it's holding a little bit more weight, it's nicer to have them a little bit closer together. Next, let's chat about choosing colors, because I think this is so much fun and can be as creative as you like or not in this process. So a lot of granny squares that you're going to see have repeating color schemes, and that's fantastic. If you find something you love, you could make this out of entirely granny squares in one color pattern. My recommendation for how to go about doing this is to start with any yarn you might have in colors that you like, and start holding them up next to each other once you get to a round and being like, okay, maybe I want to do this one next. And then knit your round, and then look at another skein of yarn and be like, okay, I want to see how this color will look next to it, and then add that there. It is so much fun to kind of play around with different colors, to play with different schemes on the color wheel and see what appeals to you. When I'm running out of ideas, one of the things I like to do is actually reverse a colorway. So for example, these are really fun. So this is a blue going into kind of an orange, and then on this one, I just reversed it. So I started with the yellow and then I went out into that super dark blue. Another way to come up with different color schemes is using different references from the internet and whatnot. I will add a photo here for this color scheme. Is from a Galliano for Margiela collection that just the color scheme stuck in my head in this particular look, and I wanted to basically swatch it out and see if it worked conceptually together outside of the context of that outfit. But you can just play around, find different colorways that you enjoy. I found a couple that I really did like to repeat. As you can see here, these ones are actually larger squares, but they are some repetitions of similar colors that I discovered that I really, really liked. I haven't counted the number of colors in this sweater, but it's really not that many. What you'll see is I kept reusing the same yarn because it's what I had. And you can even see in some of these top ones. And I think if you're constantly playing around with the different colors, when you get to the point where you're starting to put together the sweater, it's really fun to have different colors to put next to each other that have some similar through lines. So if you start with a finite amount of yarn that you're constantly using, you're gonna see the different yarn showing up in different squares, which does kind of make everything nice and cohesive. And then of course we will always put a border around in this particular case, which really starts to pull everything together. So you've finished all of your granny squares and it's time to add a border. Congratulations. There are so many different ways to add a border, and it's really up to you what you would like to use. I, in particular, use what is, I believe, called a picot border. I actually used a video that I'm going to link below, which has a ton of options for how to put a border on your granny square. The reason I really like this particular border is I think it's really easy. It's based on a slip stitch, and you end up with this really nice finish, and then you get this lovely braiding on the edge. Next, we're going to talk about the seaming together, and this is actually pretty much the same stitch again. I will link below different options for joining things together. You can take an embroidery needle and you can kind of stitch them together by hand. I really like to do, it's essentially just a slip stitch that is done through the back of the braids on each of these two. So starting to get into construction, how many granny squares do you need? Well, we need 6 on the front and 6 on the back for the body, so that's 12. We need 1 for each shoulder, so that puts us at 14, and then we need 3 for the neck, which puts us at 17. I think I did my math correctly. So when we are starting to seam together, you're gonna need a row of 2 by 3 across. So start by just putting those together, and then the exact same thing on the back, a 2 by 3 row there, and you are going to have the basis of the body. Starting to put this together, you're going to notice that you have the option when you are doing your joining stitch of grabbing the full side braid here, or just grabbing the front or grabbing the back. For this particular technique that I used, I grabbed the back side of the braid only so that the front actually opens up a little bit and you see some of that contrasting pink thread through there. I also did use a size 7 hook on this to just bring it in a little bit tighter. You could use a larger hook, you're just gonna have a little bit looser of seam, so it just makes it a little bit more compact there. Taking 2 together here and joining the side, then joining another side, then starting to join the top. And if you should have exactly the same amount of stitches on the top and the bottom of each of your square for your borders here that you can match up to join together. Once you have the front and the back, join them together on the sides evenly. So you're going to basically have 2 rectangles that become a circle joined together. So the collar, as you can see, kind of rolls on its own. It's just 3 of the squares standing up here, and they naturally curve, so you end up with something that's like a mock or a roll neck. But as you can see, it's just 3 squares here that are joined together on the sides. So the first thing you're gonna do with the collar is you're just gonna join 3 of your squares along one side, and then you're gonna end up with a nice little loop of 3 squares. You'll have a loop here and a loop here, and then we'll start putting these two together. Easiest to start with the backs. We're using exactly the same stitch that we have been talking about, and you're going to take the center of your seams for your 3 square neck, and you're gonna align it with the center stitch of this back piece here. And then if you just lay them next to each other like that, you can start joining, and you're going to join across evenly for 2 more of these little groups of stitches. So we're going to have, and the way that on this particular pattern works is, so this stitch grouping grabs the center here, and then this one ends up kind of lining up with this gap here, and then using this one to line up with that gap there. So we join them from here to here basically for that first piece. Then we're gonna do exactly the same thing, but we don't have that center line. So instead we're going to find this center group of stitches and line it up exactly with this front here. Line these two up. And as you can see, we're basically doing the same width on either side, which will make this a sweater that you could wear back to front, front to back. Does the same thing. Pro tip from Instagram, somebody whose daughter put this together, is that she put it on her brother as she was piecing it together and found it made more sense to follow the instructions when it was actually on a body. And as you can see, I'm doing this on the mannequin, but when I was doing it on myself, I was doing it on my actual body. You actually see how it's laying, how it's fitting, etc. So I do recommend, if you can put it on yourself, that's great. If you can find someone else, that's also great. At this point, we have our rectangle in the front, our rectangle in the back, our circle of rectangles that is now joined right here in the center and right here in the back, which means you will have basically a hanging section here that has nothing on it. You will have an open section on your shoulder, and you will have an open section here in the front. And that is where we put our 2 remaining squares. I think this is the trickiest part, since we are going to not be doing square to square, whereas everything is pretty even up to this point. So bear with me, and again, if you have any questions, if I'm not explaining something well, hop in the comments and I'm happy to clarify. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the square, one of our squares, and put the corner right in this gap between these 2 granny squares here. And to keep things even, we're going to play this game where we match up the clumps of stitches. So this is where this is helpful if you used a traditional granny square pattern. If not, just start thinking about what would line up in your particular stitch pattern on your granny square. So as you can see, we have this section lined up with this one here, this one lined up here, and what that's going to do is make the amount of little braided stitches that you bring together, it's going to make them even. So if you know where your corners are, you can actually start grabbing it. So if I follow this one up to the top, I follow this one up to the top, you can see that's where we're going to start joining. So if you just stick this guy in the corner here, grab a braid, and then start joining across, you will be joining along the neckline. You'll join this top edge all the way till you get to the other side on the back. So that's a great way to start. We're going to start with this top side here, and you just keep joining until you've basically filled that gap between the front and the back. Then I would go ahead and do the other side. And again, what you're going to do is take your last granny square, stick it in the gap here, stick the corner right in there, and stick the corner right in here. Line up these little stitch guys, and then you're going to join all the way across so that this neck is closed. Then the last thing that you're going to need to do is join the shoulder to the body here. So you'll notice it doesn't extend all the way, and that's because if we stitched it all the way down, we'd close the armhole, but by stitching out like this, we essentially create a nice space for your arm to live. And line up based on our little stitch groupings here, and just join again using that exact same stitch all the way across until this side of the square is complete. So as you can see, it only makes it about halfway through this body piece, and that's perfect because then the body piece will naturally droop on both sides, and this essentially forms your armhole, which you could then use, of course, to attach a sleeve by kind of continuing that shape, which we'll talk about in a moment. And there you have your fabulous finished sweater. Bonus content, let's talk about sleeves. So the sweater that I'm wearing right now is a continuation of the same concept. As you can see, I left it a little bit cropped. It has a nice space to be joined here and extended. So the sweater that I'm wearing right now is basically put together in exactly the same way, only I added one more round on the granny squares, and then which made them bigger, and then joined together in a slightly different way. So the collar on this one is actually only 2 granny squares, but I didn't want it to be super even, so they're actually not joined in the center pieces. They're joined offset, but it makes for a narrower collar, which you could pretty much do the same thing with this if you wanted to. And then for the sleeves, again, these are larger granny squares, but what I did was I took this sleeve piece here, and if you just continue by adding another piece, it continues the arm and you can create a nice shape here going down. Long story short, once you've mastered kind of the techniques of joining these together, you can start playing around with the way you join your squares, because again, this one was first, the fronts were joined together, the backs were joined together, the neck was set in here, and then you piece the shoulder piece right there, and then you can start adding. So again, I would have started this one closer down here, but that closes your arm, and then that allows you to create a bunch of fun little shapes. And that is how we make a granny square sweater. Now that the sweater is complete, we have 2 optional last steps. The first is weaving in the ends. So as you're making these little granny sweaters, and if you didn't weave in the little threads, they're gonna be sticking out. You can then go in and weave them in. I chose not to because I do like the fact that it makes the sweater look like I made it at home, which I did, and I'm very proud of that. So I actually kind of like the little spunk that it gives it. And then the last option is to potentially do one more border around all of your edges. So I'll give you an example here. This is a balaclava that I made, and as you can see, it had the border that is joined right through the back loops. Again, same technique, but on the inside here, I did one more round of border stitch just to give it a nice, really clean finish, cohesive edge. So that is another option if you want to do that around the body, around the armholes, to give it a really polished look, potentially even switching the color to give it a little bit more funk and pizzazz. If you got stuck at any point, feel free to leave me a comment or find me at social media at Rebecca in Europe on all handles. And speaking of cute little hoods, you can see I really like this colorway, so I kept repeating it in this hood. And what I'm thinking we should do next is an actual hoodie out of granny squares. Seems like it would be absolutely fabulous for the summer months, but we're gonna need to switch yarns to maybe a cotton. So if that sounds exciting to you, make sure you give me a follow. Again, you can find me on all socials at Rebecca in Europe. If you do make anything inspired by this video, make sure you are tagging me. I want to see let's be internet friends. I love to celebrate your work, and it's so rewarding for me to think that I might have actually helped teach someone something. So thanks so much, and we will see you next time.